He was the most feared military commander in the Middle East, not because he wore medals or commanded a conventional army, not because he gave press conferences or appeared at international summits. He was feared because for more than 2 decades, he operated in the dark. He moved between countries like a ghost. He built networks, armed militias, funded proxy wars, and shaped the destiny of entire nations, all while remaining, for much of the world, a name whispered in intelligence briefings and never spoken aloud in polite diplomatic company. His enemies called him a terrorist. His followers called him a living martyr. The man who led Iran's most elite foreign operations force for over 2 decades was not some shadowy, unknown figure hunched over maps in a bunker. He was famous. He was celebrated. He had 800,000 followers on Instagram before the Americans banned his account. And yet, for all his visibility, for all his arrogance, for all the ways he had begun to believe he was untouchable, he never saw the last night coming. On January 3, 2020, at 12:47 in the morning, somewhere just outside Baghdad International Airport, 2 vehicles rolled down an access road in the Iraqi night. Inside one of those vehicles sat General Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Quds Force, the most powerful Iranian military figure to ever step foot on foreign soil. Above him, 3 American drones circled silently at altitude. Below him, Delta Force sniper teams lay concealed in the dark, safeties off, fingers on triggers, watching his every move through night optics. In Tel Aviv, Israeli intelligence officers worked phones in coordination with their American counterparts. In Washington, senior officials sat in the Situation Room watching drone feeds in real time. At Mar-a-Lago, in Florida, President Donald Trump listened by audio link as military officials counted down the seconds. 2 minutes and 11 seconds. 1 minute, 30 seconds, 10, 9, 8. Then the Hellfire missiles came down. And Qasem Soleimani was gone. This is not a story about a single missile strike. This is the story of how the world's most powerful intelligence apparatus, the CIA, working alongside Israeli intelligence, tracked, hunted, and ultimately ended the career of the man who had shaped the course of the modern Middle East for over 20 years. It is a story about informants who paid with their lives, about intelligence tradecraft operating at the razor's edge, about the long institutional memory of agencies that had been watching one man for decades. It is a story about the accumulation of grudges, the slow burn of institutional frustration, and the singular moment when every thread of intelligence, human sources, electronic intercepts, signals technology, drone reconnaissance, converged on a single access road in Baghdad. It is also a story about the cost of what came next. To understand how Qasem Soleimani was killed, you first have to understand how he was built. He was born in 1957 in the rural highlands of Kerman province in southeastern Iran into a poor farming family. By his own account, he came to the city of Kerman as a teenager to find work in construction, helping to pay off his father's debts. He had no formal military education, no family connections to the military establishment, no path that anyone looking at him in 1978 would have identified as leading to supreme military power. What he had was something harder to quantify, an instinct for loyalty, an almost fanatical devotion to discipline, and a raw capacity for violence that the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was about to transform into a career. When Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini swept the Shah from power in 1979, Iran's new Islamic Republic needed fighters, not generals. The Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, was being assembled from scratch. Built not from the old military establishment, which was considered tainted by its association with the Shah, but from young ideological volunteers. Soleimani joined the IRGC almost immediately after the revolution, drawn by the ideology, by the momentum, by the sense that history was being made. His training, by later accounts, was minimal, but he advanced rapidly, because in the chaos of a revolutionary state building its military, the men who rose were the ones who showed results. The real forge of Soleimani's identity was the Iran-Iraq War, which began in September 1980 when Saddam Hussein launched his invasion of Iran. Soleimani went to the front. He commanded a company of men from Kerman province, men he had personally recruited and trained, and he fought in some of the most brutal conditions of that 8-year war. He was known on the front lines for his physical bravery. Reportedly, he never wore a flak jacket, even in conditions where other commanders stayed well behind the lines. He was seriously wounded in one major operation. He rose through the ranks not through bureaucratic maneuvering but through combat, earning command of the 41st Thurala Division while still in his 20s. It was in this war that he also began developing something that would define his entire career: relationships with Shia communities across borders, particularly the Iraqi Shia and the Kurdish opposition to Saddam Hussein. He was not just learning to fight. He was learning to build networks across enemy territory, and that education would prove far more valuable than any battlefield commission. By the mid-1990s, Soleimani had moved into a different kind of warfare. The guns of the Iran-Iraq War had fallen silent, but the Islamic Republic had a new strategic vision, one that required not conventional armies but proxy networks, clandestine relationships, and the slow, patient work of building influence inside other countries' political and military structures. Sometime between 1997 and early 1998, Soleimani was appointed commander of the Quds Force. The name itself is telling. Quds is the Persian word for Jerusalem. The force was named for a city it intended to one day see liberated from Israeli control. Its mission was to project Iranian power beyond Iran's borders, using every tool short of open conventional warfare: training, funding, arming, advising, and when necessary, killing. Under Soleimani, the Quds Force became something that had no real equivalent in Western military doctrine. It was part intelligence agency, part special operations force, part diplomatic arm of the supreme leader's foreign policy. It operated in Lebanon with Hezbollah, helping that organization evolve from a militia into a formidable fighting force capable of standing against the Israeli military. It operated in Afghanistan, where Soleimani recognized even before the September 11 attacks that a U.S. intervention was coming, and positioned Iran's proxies to shape whatever came after. It operated in Iraq, where after the American invasion of 2003 removed Saddam Hussein, inadvertently Soleimani's greatest gift, the elimination of Iran's most dangerous regional rival, the Quds Force moved swiftly to fill the vacuum. The scale of what Soleimani built in Iraq after 2003 was staggering to American military planners who watched it unfold in real time. Iran had worked to develop the IED as a weapon, and under Quds Force direction, increasingly sophisticated roadside bombs began killing American soldiers. The Pentagon later concluded that Iran was responsible for 17% of all U.S. service personnel deaths in Iraq between 2003 and 2011. Then came the EFPs, explosively formed projectiles, a more sophisticated, more lethal weapon whose design pointed unmistakably to Iranian military factories. These devices were manufactured in Iran under confidential Quds Force orders and distributed across Iraq. Each one that detonated under an American vehicle was, in effect, an act of war, deniable, invisible, prosecuted by proxies, and orchestrated by one man who had the strategic patience to play a very long game. American soldiers were dying on roads in Iraq because of decisions made in offices in Tehran, and the man making those decisions was Qasem Soleimani. One of the remarkable aspects of Soleimani's story is how a man who operated almost entirely in the shadows became, by the 2010s, almost a celebrity. The Syrian civil war that began in 2011 changed his public profile dramatically. When Bashar al-Assad's government began to crumble under the weight of a popular uprising, Soleimani reportedly flew to Moscow to personally convince Russian leadership that Assad could be saved, and separately worked to convince Iran's supreme leader Khamenei that Syrian intervention was strategically essential. He described Syria as providing Iran with strategic depth. He argued that losing Assad would mean losing the entire arc of Iranian influence from Tehran to the Mediterranean, the land corridor that connected Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon, the chain that was the physical spine of the axis of resistance. Khamenei agreed. And Soleimani personally directed the deployment of thousands of Quds Force operatives and affiliated Shia militias from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan into Syria. He was not commanding from a distance. Former CIA officer John McGuire later said that Soleimani personally orchestrated the retaking of the Syrian city of Qusair from rebel forces in 2013. Photographs began to circulate of Soleimani at the front in Syria, in Iraq, in Tikrit, sometimes standing among Shia militia fighters, sometimes appearing almost casual, posing for pictures in places where American military planners expected to see frontline soldiers, not senior generals. He had an Instagram account. He gave interviews to Iranian television. Supreme Leader Khamenei called him a living martyr and was described as having an unusually close personal relationship with him. For a man who was supposed to be a covert operator, he was becoming something the Quds Force had never had before: a face, a symbol, a brand. But here's the question. What does it mean when the world's most dangerous covert operator starts making himself visible? Is it confidence? Is it a message? Or is it the kind of hubris that comes from a decade of operating without consequence, from the growing belief that no one will ever dare touch you? Because while Soleimani was appearing in selfies and granting interviews, American and Israeli intelligence agencies were watching. They were collecting. They were building a file that had been accumulating for years. And with every new photograph, with every confirmed sighting, with every travel pattern logged and noted, that file was growing more complete. The United States' relationship with Qasem Soleimani was defined by a particular kind of institutional frustration. American intelligence analysts had been tracking his activities for years, decades in some cases. Former CIA analyst Elissa Slotkin, who later became a Democratic congresswoman, spent years inside the agency specifically analyzing Soleimani's activities. She knew his record, knew what he had done, knew the scope of his operations against American interests. The CIA had watched the IED networks. It had watched the proxy militia expansion across Iraq. It had watched the Syrian intervention. It had seen the fingerprints of the Quds Force on operations in Lebanon, Yemen, Afghanistan. The intelligence picture of Soleimani was extraordinarily detailed, not because the CIA had a spy close to him in the early years, but because his network was large enough that information about it appeared across dozens of separate intelligence streams. The question of whether to kill Soleimani had reportedly been raised and set aside multiple times across different administrations. The risk calculus was always the same. The potential blowback was enormous. Killing the commander of the Quds Force would not be like killing a militia leader or a mid-level operative. It would be an act of war against Iran itself, or at the very least, it would be interpreted as one. Iran would retaliate. The region would destabilize. American allies in Iraq and the Gulf would face enormous pressure. The diplomatic consequences could be severe. For years, that calculation kept Soleimani alive, not because of any failure of intelligence, but because of the political and strategic weight of what his death would trigger. Multiple administrations concluded the risk was too high. Soleimani, who almost certainly understood this calculus, may have drawn a certain confidence from it. The Trump administration arrived with a different set of assumptions. The maximum pressure campaign against Iran, formally announced in 2018 after the U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear deal, was explicitly designed to change Iran's strategic calculations through sustained economic pain. But as the pressure mounted, so did Iranian responses. Attacks on oil tankers in the Gulf, the shooting down of an American drone, proxy militia escalations across Iraq. The cycle was accelerating, and somewhere in that acceleration, the question of Soleimani moved from the back of the filing cabinet to the front of someone's desk. According to former officials who later spoke to journalists, serious planning discussions about killing Soleimani began inside the National Security Council as early as the summer of 2018. not as an immediate operation, but as a contingency, as a scenario that needed to be wargamed, prepared for, and kept ready. The options were being shaped, and the intelligence that would make it possible was already being gathered. Of all the tools the CIA uses, satellite imagery, electronic intercepts, drone reconnaissance, cyber operations, none is more valuable and none is more dangerous than the human being who agrees to spy on their own government. A human intelligence source in CIA terminology is irreplaceable. A satellite can tell you where a man is. A human source can tell you why he's there, who he's meeting, what he said when the meeting was over. A human source close to the Quds Force was, for American intelligence, the difference between understanding Soleimani's movements and simply observing them. The name that emerged publicly was Mahmoud Mousavi Majd, an Iranian citizen who had moved to Syria with his family in the 1990s. He became fluent in Arabic, which made him extraordinarily valuable in the Syrian conflict. He served as an interpreter and fixer for Iranian military units arriving in Syria to support the Assad regime. That positioned him, almost uniquely, at the intersection of Iranian military operations and the day-to-day logistics of Quds Force activities in Syria. He could observe, he could report. According to Iranian authorities, he was passing information about the whereabouts of Soleimani to both the CIA and Israeli intelligence, Mossad. He was arrested by Iranian security services in October 2018. Iran's judiciary announced his conviction and death sentence in June 2020, and he was executed in July of that year. The case of Mousavi Majd illuminates something critical about how intelligence operations work and how they fail. He was arrested in 2018, more than a year before the strike that killed Soleimani, which means that the intelligence he provided was not, by Iran's own account, directly linked to the final operation. And yet his presence in the story tells us something important. The CIA and Mossad had cultivated at least one human source with access to information about Soleimani's movements. That source was part of a pattern, part of the sustained, long-term intelligence effort to understand how Soleimani moved, where he went, who he met, and when he was vulnerable. Human intelligence is rarely about a single moment. It is about building a picture, one confirmed detail at a time, over months and years. And the picture being built of Soleimani was becoming very clear. The relationship between American and Israeli intelligence on the question of Iran is one of the most consequential intelligence partnerships of the modern era, and it forms an essential backbone of the Soleimani story. Israel and Iran have been locked in a covert war for decades, a shadow conflict of assassinations, sabotage operations, proxy clashes, and intelligence competition that has never fully reached the level of open war, but has never stopped either. For Israel, Soleimani was not an abstract geopolitical concern. He was the man who had personally overseen the rearming and strengthening of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the organization with the most missiles pointed at Israeli cities. He had been present in Lebanon during the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, aiding in the planning of operations against Israeli forces. He was, from Israel's perspective, the architect of the most immediate military threat to the Israeli state. Mossad had been tracking Soleimani for years through its own intelligence apparatus. When the Trump administration began seriously planning its options in late 2019, American and Israeli intelligence sharing on Soleimani's movements went into a higher gear. In the final hours before the strike, U.S. Joint Special Operations Command liaisons were working directly with their Israeli counterparts in Tel Aviv to track Soleimani's cell phone patterns. This is the Israeli thread that runs through the entire operation, not as a matter of public credit, not as an official joint operation, but as the quiet professional cooperation of two intelligence services that had spent years watching the same man and building overlapping pictures of his behavior. The Israelis had access to phone numbers associated with Soleimani. They passed those numbers to the Americans. American signals intelligence operatives used that data to track and confirm his position. The tradecraft was invisible. The result was not. There is a lesson here about the architecture of modern intelligence operations. No single agency, No single source, no single technology wins alone. The picture that enabled the Soleimani strike was assembled from dozens of overlapping sources: human intelligence from informants, signals intelligence from phone tracking, reconnaissance from drones, pattern of life analysis built over months, real-time confirmation from operatives on the ground. The CIA provided the strategic intelligence and the long institutional knowledge of Soleimani's network. Israeli intelligence provided the phone intelligence and the signals data. Special operations forces provided the tactical ground capability. Kurdish partner forces provided the critical positive identification on the ground. Each piece was essential. Remove any one of them, and the operation does not happen. By November 2019, the machinery had shifted into a different gear. According to officials who later spoke to journalists, National Security Council planners received guidance that they needed to ensure options for targeting Soleimani were fully developed and ready to execute. This was not yet an order to strike. It was a recognition that the environment was changing fast and that contingency plans needed to be in place. Soleimani was being tracked more closely than ever. His travel patterns were being analyzed. The intelligence community was watching for windows of opportunity. Moments when he would be in a place and a situation where a strike was feasible, where the collateral damage risk was manageable, and where the political and legal conditions for action could be met. Victoria Coates, then serving as the Deputy National Security Advisor for the Middle East, later recalled that the intelligence community had been following Soleimani closely and had noticed a pattern. When he traveled to certain locations, bad things happened to American interests in the region shortly afterward. That observation was not coincidental. It reflected the intelligence picture that had been built over months. Soleimani did not travel randomly. He traveled to coordinate, to direct, to personally supervise operations. His physical presence in a location was itself an intelligence indicator, a sign that something was being planned or executed. The CIA and its partners had learned to read those movements not just as travel events but as strategic signals. The spiral toward the final decision accelerated dramatically in the last days of December 2019. On December 27th, a rocket attack by Kataib Hezbollah, an Iraqi militia backed and directed by the Quds Force, struck the K-1 military base near Kirkuk in northern Iraq, killing an American civilian contractor and wounding multiple American service members. The death of an American citizen was, according to multiple former officials, a red line for President Trump. It changed the calculus. The United States launched retaliatory airstrikes on Kataib Hezbollah positions on December 29th, killing at least 25 militants. Then, on December 31st, supporters of Kataib Hezbollah stormed the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad. They broke through the outer gate. They burned and vandalized the outer buildings. The images of an American embassy under siege recalled, for Trump and for many Americans, the 1979 hostage crisis. Trump publicly blamed Iran directly and warned of consequences. The storming of the embassy was the moment that crystallized the decision. Senior officials, including Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley, were presented with a menu of options. According to later reporting, the option to kill Soleimani was included in that menu, and the officials presenting it reportedly expected it to be rejected in favor of more limited responses, as had been the case in every prior administration. Instead, Trump approved it. Approved. The 72 hours that followed were among the most tightly held operational periods in recent American intelligence history. The circle of people who knew what was being planned was deliberately kept small. The deliberate decision to exclude Iraq from the planning was significant. American forces were operating on Iraqi soil, inside a sovereign nation, and the Iraqi government was not told. This was not an oversight. It was a calculated choice. Iraqi political leadership included figures with close ties to Iranian-backed militias. If word of the planned strike leaked into those circles, Soleimani would simply not show up. The entire operation depended on operational security so tight that even the host country was kept in the dark until after the fact. What did Soleimani know? In the 6 hours before he boarded his flight from Damascus, the Iranian general switched cell phones 3 times. 3 times. This was a man who understood surveillance tradecraft. He knew that mobile phones were intelligence liabilities. He rotated devices regularly as a standard security practice. And yet, on the night of January 3, 2020, in the darkness over Iraq, the signals intelligence technology brought to bear by the Americans and their Israeli partners was sophisticated enough that tracking him across multiple phone changes was still possible. The Israelis had his numbers. Task Force Orange, a highly secretive army unit specializing in close-range signals intelligence, had operatives on the ground in Baghdad that night, providing what operators call knob turners, specialists who could home in on Soleimani's electronics at close range to confirm his precise position. The operational plan that unfolded at Baghdad International Airport in the early hours of January 3, 2020, was a marvel of layered redundancy. Nothing was left to chance. 3 separate Delta Force sniper teams had been pre-positioned at concealed locations around the airport, disguised as maintenance workers, hidden in old buildings and vehicles along the access road that led from the airfield. They had set themselves up 600 to 900 yards from the designated kill zone, close enough for accuracy, far enough to avoid detection. One of the snipers had a spotting scope with a camera attached, live streaming the feedback to the Delta Ground Force commander, who was based at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. The commander could see in real time everything his teams could see. Kurdish counter-terrorism group operators, an elite Kurdish unit with deep links to American special operations, had been inserted into the airport itself. One Kurdish operative, disguised as airport ground crew, guided Soleimani's flight to its designated spot on the tarmac. Other Kurdish CTG operators, posing as baggage handlers, were positioned to make visual confirmation of the target the moment he stepped off the plane. This is the part of the story that reveals how much of the operation depended on human beings on the ground, not just technology in the sky. A drone at altitude can track a vehicle. It cannot identify a face through a crowd with the same certainty. The Kurdish operatives provided the human confirmation, the eyes-on verification that the man stepping off that plane was indeed Qasem Soleimani, and not a decoy, not a staff member, not anyone else. The flight from Damascus was late, several hours behind schedule. The sniper teams lay in their positions in the Iraqi darkness, waiting. The drones orbited overhead. In Washington, officials in the Situation Room waited. At Mar-a-Lago, Trump listened by audio link. And then, finally, the Damascus flight touched down. The plane taxied toward the closed-off portion of the airfield. A Kurdish operative guided it to a halt, and Soleimani stepped off the plane. The confirmation passed through the chain. He loaded into 2 vehicles with his entourage, among them Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, deputy commander of the Popular Mobilization Forces, himself a senior figure in Iran's Iraqi proxy network. The convoy pulled away from the tarmac toward the access road, toward the kill zone, toward the 3 Delta Force teams lying still in the dark. Above them, the 2 armed Reaper drones were already locked on. What would you do with 2 minutes and 11 seconds if those were the last 2 minutes and 11 seconds of everything you had built? The Hellfire missiles came down at 12:47 in the morning. 2 struck Soleimani's vehicle, obliterating it. The second vehicle made a run for it, accelerating toward the road before a Delta Force sniper engaged, stopping it in its tracks. A third Hellfire missile then destroyed it completely. The access road was fire and wreckage. 10 people were killed in total, including Soleimani and Muhandis. And then, in the silence that followed the strike, something happened that almost no one reported at the time. A Kurdish operative, disguised as an Iraqi police officer, walked calmly to the wreckage of Soleimani's vehicle. He took photographs. He obtained a tissue sample for DNA confirmation, and then he walked away and vanished into the night. Even in the aftermath of the strike, the operational tradecraft held. The confirmation was biological. The result was certain. Qasem Soleimani was dead. The world learned what had happened before dawn on January 3, 2020. The Pentagon issued a statement confirming the strike, saying it had been carried out at the direction of the president and was intended to deter future attacks. Within hours, the geopolitical shockwaves began to move. In Tehran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who had called Soleimani a living martyr and wept over his coffin at the state funeral, pledged severe revenge. Iran's immediate political response was measured in a way that belied the fury of its public rhetoric. The government understood that open war with the United States was not survivable, but it could not do nothing. On January 8th, Iran launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi military bases housing U.S. troops, the Al-Assad Air Base and the Erbil facility. The IRGC claimed responsibility almost immediately and framed it explicitly as retaliation for Soleimani's killing. The missiles carried warheads between 1,000 and 2,000 pounds. They struck the bases with considerable accuracy, and yet no American service members were killed. Dozens suffered traumatic brain injuries in the immediate aftermath and in the weeks that followed. But the Iranian strike was calibrated, deliberately, to stop short of causing American deaths. It was retaliation designed to satisfy Iranian domestic political requirements without triggering a full American military response. It was, in its own way, a masterpiece of controlled escalation. In Iraq, the political fallout was immediate and severe. The Iraqi parliament voted on a non-binding resolution calling for the expulsion of all U.S. and foreign forces from Iraqi territory. The vote reflected the deep anger in Iraq at the fact that the United States had conducted a lethal military operation on Iraqi soil against a guest of the Iraqi government, for Soleimani had arrived in Baghdad following an Iraqi government invitation without any notification to Baghdad. The Iraqi prime minister called it a flagrant violation of sovereignty. The relationship between Washington and Baghdad, already complex and fragile, entered one of its most difficult periods. In the months that followed the strike, Iran's intelligence services moved with grim efficiency to identify those who had helped make it possible. The name that emerged was Mahmoud Mousavi Majd, an Iranian citizen, a man who had lived among the Quds Force operatives in Syria who had served as their interpreter and fixer, and who had at some point made the decision to become an informant for the CIA and Mossad. Iran announced his conviction and death sentence in June 2020. The judiciary spokesman said he had shared information about the whereabouts of Soleimani with our enemies. He had passed security information about Iran's armed forces, particularly the Revolutionary Guards. He was executed in July 2020. The announcement was striking in its speed. It came almost exactly 6 months after Soleimani's death, a timeline that some security officials interpreted as Iran demonstrating its capacity to identify and punish those who had betrayed the Islamic Republic. One American security official who spoke to journalists at the time expressed the belief that detailed information made public by U.S. media about how Soleimani had been tracked, including specifics about confirmed flight manifests and source confirmations, had made it easier for Iranian counterintelligence to narrow down the suspects. If this is the Americans' guy, they really fed him with releasing all the details on how they tracked Soleimani, the official said. This is the part of the story that does not appear in press conferences or victory speeches. Every time an intelligence operation succeeds publicly, the tradecraft that made it possible is partially exposed. Every detail published about how Soleimani was tracked, every confirmed fact about informants, phone surveillance, flight confirmation, was simultaneously a lesson for adversaries about how to find and eliminate future sources. Mahmoud Mousavi Majd paid with his life. Whether he understood the risk fully when he agreed to provide intelligence to the CIA and Mossad, only he could have answered. But the pattern is an old one. The source closest to the target is always the most valuable and always the most exposed. The killing of Soleimani did not resolve the debate it ignited. It deepened it. At the core of the controversy was a question that cut directly to the legitimacy of the entire operation. Was the threat imminent? The administration's legal justification for the strike rested on the claim that Soleimani was actively developing plans to attack American diplomats and service members in Iraq and throughout the region, and that the strike was therefore a defensive action under the laws of armed conflict. Secretary of State Pompeo said the attacks Soleimani was planning were imminent. But intelligence leaks in the days following the strike suggested the picture was more complicated, that the specific threat intelligence was less definitive than the public framing implied. The UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings, Agnes Callamard, issued a report in July 2020 concluding that the strike was a violation of international law. She argued that the United States had failed to provide evidence of an imminent attack that would have legally justified a preemptive strike under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Secretary Pompeo rejected this finding. The legal debate over what constitutes imminent threat, over whether a state can lawfully kill a foreign military official in the territory of a third country without that country's consent, did not produce a consensus. It produced arguments that are still being made in international law classrooms and government legal offices around the world. The precedent set by the strike was recognized immediately and widely as one of its most consequential aspects. No senior state military official of this rank had ever been targeted and killed by a foreign power through a precision drone strike in this manner. Soleimani was not hiding in a cave. He was traveling on what was, in some respects, a diplomatic mission. He arrived in a country with which the United States maintained formal relations. He was killed on the tarmac of an international airport. The norms that had implicitly protected senior military figures from this kind of targeting, norms that had existed since the Second World War at least, had been shattered in a single 10-second operation. If you are finding this story as gripping and troubling as these events deserve, if you are sitting with the weight of what it means that these are the decisions governments make in the dark, in the gap between what is known and what is justified, then consider leaving a comment below. There's one question worth debating. Was killing Soleimani a victory, or did it create more problems than it solved? Drop your answer below. And if this kind of deep dive documentary is what you want to see more of, subscribing keeps these stories coming. Because here's what makes the Soleimani story genuinely complex. The strategic consequences of the strike did not match the immediate tactical result in any clean, satisfying way. Soleimani was dead. His successor as Quds Force commander, Brigadier General Esmail Ghani, was appointed within hours. Ghani had worked alongside Soleimani for decades and had been deputy commander of the Quds Force since 1997. The institutional knowledge, the network relationships, the operational capacity of the Quds Force, none of it vanished with Soleimani. The machine he had built was larger than one man. Proxy networks in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen did not dissolve. The Shia militias he had trained and armed and ideologically indoctrinated continued to operate. Hezbollah did not demobilize. The Houthis in Yemen did not stop fighting. The axis of resistance continued. Iran's decision to abandon the remaining restrictions of the nuclear deal, announced on January 5, 2020, 2 days after the strike, was perhaps the most strategically significant consequence. Iran announced it would no longer abide by limits on uranium enrichment imposed by the 2015 JCPOA. This was not a decision made in grief or anger alone. It was a strategic calculation. The killing of Soleimani, combined with the maximum pressure sanctions campaign, was pushing Iran toward a conclusion that had enormous long-term implications. That restraint in its nuclear program had not purchased security, that the constraints were not being reciprocated, and that the only insurance policy against the kind of strike that had killed Soleimani was the development of a nuclear deterrent. Whether that calculation proves correct in the long run, whether it accelerates or delays Iran's nuclear ambitions, remains one of the unresolved strategic questions of our time. What the Soleimani operation demonstrated, above all else, was the extraordinary maturity and depth of the intelligence apparatus that had been built and sustained over decades of patient work. The strike did not succeed because of a single breakthrough, a single recruited asset, a single technological innovation. It succeeded because of the accumulation of years, of human intelligence cultivation, of signals intelligence development, of drone surveillance capability, of partner force relationships with Kurdish operators who trusted American trainers enough to risk their lives in the kill zone, of Israeli intelligence cooperation developed through decades of aligned interests. The CIA's role in the Soleimani operation was not primarily in the final trigger pull. That was JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command. The CIA's role was in the intelligence architecture that made the strike possible. The long-term pattern-of-life analysis, the human source networks, the coordination with Israeli intelligence, the institutional knowledge of Soleimani's behavior that had been built up over years of close surveillance. The agency that had been watching Soleimani operate for 2 decades, that had analysts who had spent years of their professional lives tracking his every known movement, provided the foundation of understanding without which no tactical operation was possible. The Mossad's contribution reveals something specific about the value of intelligence partnerships built on genuinely aligned interests. Israel and the United States did not share identical strategic goals with respect to Soleimani. America's primary grievance was the killing of American soldiers through proxy networks. Israel's primary grievance was Soleimani's decades of work building Hezbollah into a force capable of devastating strikes on Israeli territory. But their intelligence priorities overlapped almost perfectly when it came to tracking the Quds force commander. That overlap had been exploited for years in quiet coordination. The phone intelligence that proved crucial in the final hours, the Israeli access to Soleimani's numbers, the sharing of those numbers with American signals operatives, was the product of a relationship built over a long time, not assembled in the 72 hours before the strike. Qasem Soleimani was buried in his hometown of Kerman in southeastern Iran on January 7, 2020. Hundreds of thousands of mourners lined the streets. In the crush of the crowd, a stampede broke out, killing more than 50 people. It was a final terrible irony that a man whose career had been defined by violence caused more deaths even in the act of being mourned. The Iranian government declared him a national martyr. His image appeared on murals across the country. Streets were named for him. In the iconography of the Islamic Republic, he became something close to sainthood, a figure of sacrifice and resistance whose martyrdom was supposed to inspire rather than diminish the cause he had served. But away from the iconography, the strategic reality was more ambiguous. The Quds force continued. The proxy networks continued. Iran's regional influence did not collapse. What changed was something harder to measure: the sense among senior Iranian military planners that the protection they had assumed was their due had been removed. No Iranian general could now assume that their rank, their institutional importance, their role in the machinery of the Islamic Republic constituted an immunity from American precision targeting. The rules that Soleimani's killing had broken could not be unbroken. And in every intelligence service in the world, analysts and planners took note. The precedent had been set. A state had sent a drone to kill another state's most senior operational military commander in the territory of a third state, on the tarmac of a commercial airport, in full view of the world. And the world had not collapsed. Deterrence had shifted. The geography of acceptable lethal action had expanded, and the men who sit at the top of similar organizations in similar countries now understood, in a way they had not before, that altitude provides no absolute sanctuary. There is a version of this story that is told simply as a clean victory. America's most feared adversary in the Middle East was eliminated. The most powerful network of proxy violence the region had seen in decades lost its architect. The man personally responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American service members was killed by the very kind of precision military action he had spent his career avoiding. In that version, January 3, 2020, is a story of intelligence triumph, of decades of patient tradecraft finally delivering the result it had been designed to produce. But there is another version, and it is equally true, and it does not cancel the first one. In this version, the killing of Soleimani accelerated Iran's nuclear program by removing the last argument for restraint. It deepened the crisis in U.S.-Iraq relations and gave Iranian-backed militias in Iraq new grievance and new recruits. It set a precedent for targeted killing at the highest levels of state military structures that every major power on Earth has now internalized. It resulted in the execution of at least one human source, a man who had risked his life to provide intelligence to the CIA and Mossad, and who paid for that risk with his life in an Iranian prison, his contribution to the operation buried in operational secrecy until Iran's judiciary chose to make it public. Intelligence operations are not clean. The tradecraft that enables them is built on human beings making desperate choices under extraordinary pressure, and some of those human beings do not make it home. The drone that killed Soleimani was guided by technology, but it was made possible by people, by analysts who had spent careers studying one man's movements, by Kurdish operators who lay in the dark of a Baghdad airport night waiting for a convoy, by an informant in Syria who made a choice that ultimately cost him everything, by Israeli and American intelligence professionals working phones in Tel Aviv in the hours before midnight. The missile that hit the access road outside Baghdad International Airport was the last step in a chain of human decisions that stretched back years, perhaps decades. What do you do with a man who builds a network of violence across an entire region, who arms the weapons that kill your soldiers, who operates behind layers of deniability? What do you do when the rules say you cannot reach him, and your intelligence says you finally can? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the questions that were actually asked in actual rooms by actual people carrying the weight of actual deaths. And on January 3, 2020, one answer was given, decisive, irreversible, and still unresolved in its consequences. The shadow of Qasem Soleimani, the boy from Kerman who became the most powerful covert military operator in the modern Middle East, still falls across the region he shaped. His networks did not die with him. His ideology did not die with him. But the man himself, the one who switched phones 3 times in the hours before his death, who had walked front lines without a flak jacket and survived a dozen close calls over 40 years of war, who had stood at the shoulder of supreme leaders and shaped the destinies of nations, is gone. Reduced finally to wreckage on a Baghdad road, to photographs taken by a Kurdish operative who then walked calmly away into the night. The most dangerous man in the Middle East, and in the end, not untouchable after all.